Hello and welcome to this exciting video. In this one, we'll be learning how we can make basic forms with React. Now, forms are a basic building block of the web. Every web application uses form elements as a way to accept input from the user. There are a few things to keep in mind with how forms work on the web. And in this lesson, we'll learn about those as well as various ways you can retrieve values from elements in the form, as well as a few best practices you should consider when working with form elements on the web. Now, over here, we have this username form. And right now, we are just returning this username text box and submit button. As you can see, we have this label, input type, and a button. Now, first of all, let's connect these two together. So we have this label for this input box. So what we'll do is we'll be making use of the HTML for attribute on label. And what exactly this does is when we have, let's say, an ID attribute for this with the same name that we have mentioned for HTML for. Now, if I save and reload this, so here we have the updated version. Notice how when I click on the username label, the focus gets to the text box. So that's an accessibility feature where you have this username label where if one clicks on it, it takes you to the associated input control. In this case, the text box. Now, the other thing that we need to do is ensure that we have a type defined for our button. Now, implicitly, whenever you create a button, its type is always set to submit. But here we'll be explicitly mentioning that, and it's a good practice to have type mentioned for the submit button. Now, once we have done this, what happens is if you refresh this page, you'll notice that even when you're trying to press enter key, the form submission will take place. So here in the console log, if I go to the networks tab, and here if I press enter on this form, like if I am here in the text box and press enter, you'll notice that it goes directly and does a post. There you go. So the whole page gets reloaded. Now, that's the default form behavior. So what we need to do is whenever user clicks on the submit button or presses the enter key on the form, then we need to track that or capture it and accordingly process the input that has been provided by the user. Now, to do that, we will have this form, and here on form we'll have this on submit event. Now, the on submit event will have a handler defined, and we'll be defining that. Let's call that as handle submit. So we need to define this now, and within this component itself, we'll create a function. We'll give this name handle submit, and now this handle submit will capture the data that has been entered by the user. But for now, we don't know what exactly or how exactly we can get this data. Now, one way of accessing the text box value is by making use of the JavaScript query selector. So here we can say that const username is equal to document.query selector, and you specify the input type. So here we know that the text box input type is input, and then we can say dot value over here. After this, I can just go ahead and make use of the alert. So I can simply say you entered and then the username. So now if I go here and say Jack and press enter, you'll notice that it says you entered Jack. Or if I click on submit button after entering the name, you get to see this alert coming up. But you'll also notice that as soon as I click on the submit button, the page refreshes and whatever value that we entered has been lost or wiped off. Now, to avoid this, what we can do is we can make use of the event that's triggering it. So here we are saying on submit. Now, handle submit handler can have the event itself. So the event which is being triggered now is available to us. And what we can do is we can make use of event.prevent default. And when I do this, what will happen is if I go ahead now and enter a value over here and click on submit, you get the alert message. But now the form persists. So it's not doing a refresh now because we are preventing that from happening. So using event.prevent default, we can ensure that the form stays in the actual state that we want it to be. Now, coming on to this line where we are saying document.querySelector input. This is a very generic statement. Consider you have more than one inputs over here, and in that case, this statement will fail. So, what could be the other way of accessing this? Let's comment out and try to figure it out. So here, I've commented this one. Now what next we can do is, this event that we have over here has an attribute called target. So if I go over here and try accessing that, console.log event.target, and save this, let's enter a value over here, click on submit, and go to console over here. You can see that we have the whole form available to us, and here we have this data that is coming up. So it's exactly how we see it in the Elements tab. But what we can do over here is, let's find out the attributes of it. So we'll make sure that we get that. So using console.dir, we can get that. So if I now go ahead and enter this information, here you can see I'm getting the whole form. And you'll notice that we have this target thing, event.target. So event.target is what? The form itself, because that's what is triggering the event on submit. And over here on top, you can see 0 and 1. Now 0 is basically pointing to the text box and 1 is pointing to the input. So the other way of accessing this, considering that this form is going to just contain these two elements, we can say const username is equal to event.target, and then we specify the index value. So here we know that at 0 index position we have the username input, so we can just go ahead and say value over here. And now let's go ahead and enter the name and click on submit. Here you can see that it's still getting that Jack value coming up, and we are able to get that value. But again, if you are going to add some more input elements on top of it, this is going to fail again. So what next? So there's one alternative to this particular thing, and that is we have target dot elements, and here also we have the same index position thing. So if I show you the form over here and scroll down a bit, you will find elements coming up, and within the elements you will see the form collection coming up. And here also you have the 0 and 1. So at 0 index position we have the text box, and then at index position 1 we have the button. So using that also you are able to access the value of the text box. So here I can go ahead and enter it and click on submit, and you still get the value coming up. But again, this is also going to fail if we have more inputs before this particular input element, so the index position will falter. Now the easiest way, or the recommended way over here in this scenario, is that to make use of the ID that we have. And how we can do that? If you observe closely the elements that we were exploring here, every input has this hash username input. So that's the ID basically. So you can see this username input coming up over here as a separate element in the elements collection. So using this, we will be basically getting the value. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'll copy this portion from here, we'll paste it, and then we'll say dot username input dot value, and let's save this. And here I'll go again and I'll be entering the name, and that's what we get, Jack, as the value. Now there's one alternative as well to this, and we have explored this when we were exploring the useref hook. And for that, what we can do is, within this component we can go ahead and create a constant, and we can call this as, let's say, username input ref, and we can then make use of the hook react.useref. And this time what we need to do is copy this over here, and we can just go ahead And for the input, we can specify the ref attribute. And here we have the ref mentioned. Now, the next thing that we can do is use the ref to access the value of it. And how we can do that is by making use of the current attribute that it provides. So we can say const username is equal to, and here we have the ref name coming up, and then we'll say current dot value. Let's comment this one, save it, and let's go ahead and explore it now. So I'll enter the name over here, click on submit, and there you go. You still get the value coming up. But if you see, we have to have so many refs created if we have a number of input elements. So the recommended way over here is to access the inputs using the elements collection and having the ID attribute. So here for every element, what you can do is just have an ID attribute, and using event.target.elements, you will be able to get that particular text box or input, and from there you will be able to get the value. So let's save this now, and over here let's enter the name, and there we go. We have the value coming up to us. So in review, what we had to do here was we created a form that has the single input and a label associated to that input, and a button with the type of submit. It's really important that any button you put inside a form has a type, because implicitly it will have a type of submit. That's not entirely clear. Specifically, if you say cancel for the contents with no specified type, that gives this button any submit type, which is really confusing. If you do want to have a cancel button or a reset button, then you want to specify the type as button. So instead of submit, you will simply say button, which I know is a little redundant, but if you don't specify a type, then the type will implicitly be submit, which would really confuse your users when they try to click cancel. So we specify that type as submit. We put in submit for the value here. Then instead of putting an on-click handler on the button, we put an on-submit handler on the form. That way, any other way that the user tries to submit the form will call our submit handler. In this case, it's the enter button, and when you click on that, it will trigger the on submit event. Then to avoid a full page refresh, we use event.preventDefault, and then we retrieve the user's input using event target to get the form, and then elements to get the elements of the form, and username input to retrieve the input by its ID. Then we get the value from that input to get our username, and then we alert that to our users. Or you could submit this to a backend server.